Edward Langley, now in his 70s, returned to Black Hollow Village for the first time in more than 5 decades, his steps slow, deliberate, and heavy with the weight of years and memories he'd long tried to forget. The village was smaller now, quieter too, as if the place itself was holding its breath, waiting. He arrived just after dawn, stepping off the motor coach with his hat in hand, his knees stiff from the ride, his heart heavier still. The streets he had once raced down as a boy now seemed narrower, swallowed by weeds and creeping moss. Half the cottages stood empty, shutters closed tight like sleeping eyes, and the few people he did see shuffled past with downcast gazes, their faces familiar in the way old photographs are worn thin by time. Edward made his way through the misty lanes to the house where he and his sister Margaret had been raised, the house she had never left. It was a crooked 2-story, slate-roofed and listing slightly, its garden overgrown and wild with brambles and nettles, as if it too had given up waiting for anyone to return. He paused at the iron gate, letting his fingers rest on the cold metal latch for a long moment before pushing it open. The funeral had been the day before, a sparse gathering of weathered faces and black umbrellas, their eyes darting toward the sky as if rain was the worst of their worries. They murmured polite condolences and spoke of Margaret with careful words, but Edward had noticed their glances toward the lake's direction, the way they seemed uneasy in their own skin as they stood near him. Afterward, he found himself in the sitting room, standing before the old oak writing desk where Margaret had written her letters, kept her accounts, and penned the journals he wasn't yet ready to read. There was a faint scent of lavender still clinging to the corners of the house, though it had been uninhabited for months, and it stirred something in him he couldn't quite name. He slid open the lower drawer and found, immediately, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tucked away as if waiting for his return. He peeled back the cloth with care, revealing a single cream-colored envelope, its edges softened by time, his name written on it in Margaret's looping script that he hadn't seen in years. His throat tightened as he slid his thumb beneath the flap and withdrew the contents. A small iron key, cold and heavy in his palm, its old-fashioned teeth dull with rust, and a folded sheet of paper brittle at the edges. It was a map, hand-drawn in the careful ink strokes of his sister's hand, depicting landmarks he recognized from a childhood that seemed more like a dream than memory. Black Hollow Green, the standing stones near Hollow's copse, and then the thick line winding down to the lake's edge, where a simple label had been scrawled, the boathouse. Edward sat down heavily in the armchair by the hearth, the map spread across his knees, the key pressing cold into his palm. He had sworn long ago never to return to that place, not after what had happened to Henry. The weight of the years pressed against him as he remembered his younger brother's laughter ringing across the water, and the way it had stopped so suddenly, leaving only silence behind. No one spoke about Henry after that, not his parents, not Margaret. It was as if he had been quietly erased from their family, like a name carefully scraped off an old tombstone. But Edward had not forgotten. He had never forgotten. And now Margaret was gone too, leaving only this key and this map as her final words to him. He thought of her last letter, the one she had sent 6 months before her death, its writing shaky but deliberate. "You should come back," she had written. "Before it's too late." He had not replied. He hadn't known what to say. And now he wondered if this was what she had meant all along, that he was meant to return to the lake, to the boathouse, to face whatever it was they had all turned away from so many years ago. The next morning he dressed in his old field coat, the same one he had worn as a young man when he first left Black Hollow behind, and he tucked the iron key into his pocket with hands that trembled despite his resolve. The path to the lake was narrower than he remembered, the brambles thick and biting at his legs as he walked, his breath ragged in his chest. The sky was the color of pewter, the clouds pressing low and heavy as if they, too, carried the weight of what lay ahead. As he crested the final ridge and the lake came into view, the water lay still as black glass, the boathouse a crooked silhouette at its edge, sagging into the reeds as if it, too, was exhausted from waiting. The key in his pocket grew colder with each step, and Edward found himself whispering his brother's name beneath his breath, as if calling it back into existence might give him the strength to turn the key in the old iron lock once more. Edward stood at the threshold of the old boathouse, the iron key heavy in his pocket and his breath shallow in his chest. The building leaned precariously toward Black Hollow Lake, its woods swollen and darkened by years of rain and rot, the once sturdy beams now veiled in moss and creeping ivy. The door hung slightly ajar, swaying with an eerie creak whenever the faintest wind stirred the reeds. He hesitated, his hand resting against the rough grain of the doorframe, recalling the last time he had stood here as a boy. Back then, the boathouse had seemed almost grand in its way, sheltering their family's skiffs and fishing nets and smelling of fresh-cut cedar and tar. Now it exhaled the sour stench of mold and standing water, and as he pushed the door fully open, a brittle cascade of dust fell from the lintel like ancient ash. The inside was cloaked in shadow, but enough gray daylight filtered through the broken roof slats to reveal the skeletal remains of what had once been familiar. Splintered oars resting against a rusting winch, a pile of rotted life jackets mouldering in a corner, and a half-submerged rowboat, its hull cracked and cradling a stagnant pool where fat black beetles skated in lazy spirals. Edward stepped carefully onto the warped floorboards, testing their strength before committing his weight, each creak beneath his boots sounding too loud in the hush. He moved to the rear of the boathouse, where the water lapped softly against the lower boards, and where, as a boy, he had spent long afternoons beside his siblings, baiting hooks and dangling lines. The bench they had used was still there, half collapsed, its iron bolts rusted to thin red stains. Beside it, something caught his eye, a faint glimmer beneath a sheaf of cracked leather and sodden canvas. Kneeling, Edward peeled back the layers to reveal a battered wooden chest, no larger than a bread box, its brass fittings tarnished green. The padlock on the front was already broken, rust having devoured the hinge. He pried the lid open with slow, deliberate care, revealing a bundle wrapped in oilcloth that seeped water when he lifted it. His fingers, stiff and aching, worked to loosen the twine that bound it, and soon he was staring down at a thick book with a leather cover worn soft and smooth by time and damp. The edges of its pages were blackened, and the ink had bled in places, but the script inside was surprisingly legible. Scrawled across the inside cover was a name he had only ever heard in passing his great-grandfather, Elias Langley. Edward's pulse quickened. He had never known much about Elias beyond the stories whispered on stormy nights that he had been a fisherman, a good man, until he wasn't, until he became obsessed with something beneath the lake and vanished one winter's night, never to be seen again. Sitting cross-legged on the damp boards, Edward opened the journal and began to read. The first pages were ordinary enough notes on fish hauls, weather patterns, and equipment repairs, but soon the tone shifted. Elias wrote of changes in the water, how the fish had begun to disappear and the lake's once clear surface had darkened to a strange metallic sheen. He spoke of an unease that hung over the village, of children waking from nightmares, screaming about voices calling from the depths. He described dreams of his own, where he stood at the center of the lake on a raft of bones, and something vast and cold brushed against him from beneath. One entry, dated the winter before Elias vanished, spoke of a discovery, a stone cairn uncovered when the lake's waters briefly receded during an unusually harsh drought. The cairn, Elias wrote, had been sealed with iron chains, its surface carved with runes that made his skin prickle and his thoughts scatter. He wrote that he had broken the chains out of curiosity or desperation. He wasn't sure. What he found inside he never described in full. Only that after that day, the water never cleared again, and at night he began to hear songs. They came at first like faint humming on the wind, but then deepened into a chorus, rising from the depths, voices that were neither human nor animal, but something old and mournful. He wrote of people in the village growing ill, of disappearances, of the bells in the church tower ringing by themselves in the dead of night. The last entry chilled Edward to his core. It was brief, hurried, the writing jagged. I have seen the door. It waits beneath the silt and bone. I go now to close it. If I do not return, may the lake forgive me. Edward closed the journal with trembling hands, his breath ragged in his throat. The lake lay silent beyond the doorway, its surface still and dull, reflecting the heavy clouds above. He thought of his brother Henry again, of how he had been the first to hear the songs all those years ago, and how he had disappeared soon after. Margaret had always insisted it was an accident, but Edward had never believed her. Now, with Elias's words fresh in his mind, he felt the old dread settle in his bones like the chill of deep water. He rose stiffly to his feet, tucking the journal beneath his coat, and stepped back out into the gray daylight. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a faint sound that could have been the cry of a distant bird or the echo of something far older, calling from beneath the lake's stillness. The following morning, with the damp chill of the boathouse and Elias's journal still weighing heavily on his mind, Edward Langley found himself walking the familiar cobbled path toward the Holloway cottage, his boots crunching on the frost-laced stones. The house stood near the edge of Black Hollow village, where the old road curled into the shadow of the hills, half hidden beneath the skeletal arms of elms that had long since ceased to bloom. Martha Holloway had lived there all her life, and though her hair had whitened and her frame shrunk into a fragile curve with age, her sharp mind and steady gaze had not faltered. She was, as Edward often thought, the last true keeper of their village's uneasy past, the one who had stayed behind when others packed their lives and left, refusing to speak of what they'd seen, what they'd heard, what they'd lost. Edward's knuckles rapped softly on the door, and for a moment he wasn't sure she was there. Then the latch clicked, the door cracked open, and Martha's lined face appeared, her pale blue eyes narrowing slightly before widening with something like recognition, or was it worry? "Edward Langley," she said, voice gravelly but warm. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd finally made your way back to me." She stepped aside without another word and let him in, closing the door tight behind them as though keeping something out. The cottage smelled of sage and old books, of herbs hung to dry by the windows, and something faintly metallic beneath it all, like wet iron. Edward took a seat at her kitchen table, which was littered with yellowed papers and jars of dried lavender and foxglove, while Martha poured tea into mismatched mugs. For a while they sat in silence, steam rising between them, until Edward slid Elias's journal across the table and said simply, "I found this." Martha's hands hovered over the cover without touching it, her lips thinning into a grim line. "I'd hoped it was lost," she murmured, glancing out the window at the dark line of the lake just visible through the trees. "That book has no good in it, Edward," but he pressed on, telling her of Margaret's letter, the key, the boathouse, the entries scrawled by his great-grandfather's desperate hand. He spoke of the cairn, of the broken chains, of the songs that Elias had heard, and how they echoed the strange dreams Edward himself had begun to have, dreams of cold water pressing in from all sides, of distant voices humming beneath the ice, of bells tolling beneath the ice, of bells tolling beneath black wave. When he finished, Martha stared at him for a long time before she leaned back in her chair and sighed, as though something heavy had settled across her shoulders. "Then you need to hear the rest," she said. "No one talks about it now. Not really. Most who saw it are gone. Some by choice. Others—" She shook her head and laced her fingers together on the table. "We called them the Drowned Choir. That's what my grandmother told me when I was a girl. They were the ones who vanished after the lake swallowed the old chapel bell." Edward frowned. "The bell," Martha nodded slowly. "Before the flood there was a chapel. St. Verina's. It stood where the deep water is now, on a rise above the hollow. Your great-grandfather worshipped there. Everyone did. It was said the bell was cast from iron taken from an ancient wreck, metal that was cursed or blessed, depending on who you asked. When the rains came, heavier than they ever had before, the hollow filled faster than anyone expected. The river overflowed and they couldn't stop it. The village thought the chapel would stand, but one night, after a storm that tore the roofs off half the houses, they said they heard the bell tolling by itself. No wind, no hands to pull the rope. Just ringing. And by morning the chapel was gone. Sunk. Edward felt his throat tighten. And the people, Martha's eyes darkened. The choir. 13 of them, all in the chapel the night it was lost. Some say they were praying. Others say why they were trying to bind something that had been let loose. No one really knows. But they never came back. After that, things changed. The water went wrong. People started hearing things, first at night humming whispers. Then, during the day, they said if you listened too long, you'd hear music, not any music we'd understand. Something older, something meant for things that don't breathe air, and some couldn't stop listening. They'd walk into the water, calm as could be. Men, women, even children. They'd wade in until the lake swallowed them whole. We called them the drowned choir, too, after a while, because their mouths moved as they sank, like they were singing. Edward sat very still, his hands curled tight around the mug he'd long since stopped drinking from. "Henry," he murmured. "That's what happened to Henry." Martha nodded. "I remember. He was one of the first after the chapel." They were quiet again, only the faint ticking of the old clock on the mantel breaking the silence. Then Edward asked, "Why didn't you leave?" Martha gave him a look that was equal parts sadness and steel. "Because someone has to remember. Someone has to warn the rest. And now you've come back." "Which means you heard it too." Edward's skin prickled. He thought of the journal, of Elias's words, of the door beneath the silt and bone. "I think something's waking up," he said softly. Martha nodded once. "Then you need to be careful. It calls to the ones who have history here, the ones whose blood has touched these waters." And Edward, her voice dropped to a whisper, "If you hear the bell toll, even once, you run. You don't look back. You run until you can't hear it anymore." He swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling like a stone in his gut. But deep down, past the fear, there was something else. That quiet pool. That terrible curiosity. The coal that had drawn him back after all these years, that made the lake's stillness seem less like peace and more like breath held in waiting. He nodded slowly, rising from the table, though his legs felt heavy. Martha walked him to the door and placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "I'll keep the kettle warm," she said, "in case you come back." Edward managed a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes, and stepped out into the gray afternoon, where the mist hung low over Black Hollow Lake, and the faintest sound of something old and distant seemed to ripple just beneath the silence. The night they chose to cross Black Hollow Lake was a moonless one, as Martha insisted it must be when the sky was darkest and the water stilled to glass, reflecting nothing and revealing less. Edward Langley found himself standing at the edge of the pier well before dusk, staring across the lake's quiet expanse, where mist pooled in thick, idle swells along the distant shorelines. The old rowboat creaked beneath his weight as he tested its steadiness, fingers brushing the smooth, worn wood that smelled of brine and ancient rot. Martha arrived quietly, bundled against the cold in her long oilskin coat, her eyes more shadow than light beneath the brim of her wide felt hat. "We do this now," she said, voice low but certain. Edward only nodded. They set out just after sundown, shoving away from the dock in silence, save for the hollow clunk of the oars locking into their rusted sockets. Edward rowed and Martha watched the water, her pale hands resting on her knees as though bracing for something. The lake was unnaturally still, and every push of the oars sent ripples that seemed reluctant to spread. It was as if the lake drank them in, absorbing every disturbance. They passed the old net poles, long abandoned, their skeletal wooden arms reaching skyward, festooned with tatters of rope that swayed in the soft wind like strands of hair. Edward said nothing about how the water had changed color as they moved farther from shore, how it had darkened to an almost metallic black, slick and heavy beneath the boat. Martha seemed to notice too. This was never just water, she said, almost to herself. "We used to think it was the rain, that the flood brought something in from the outside, but this has always been here." Waiting, the words coiled tight in Edward's chest, but he kept rowing, muscles burning as they pushed into the middle of the hollow where the lake was deepest. There the air thickened, charged with a vibration that crawled into his bones. A low hum, too deep to be sound, but there nonetheless felt in his teeth, his skull, the pulse at his throat. Martha lifted a hand, then, as if signaling him to stop. He let the oars drift, the boat slowing to a stop, bobbing gently as the last ripples faded. They sat in silence, listening. Beneath them, the water seemed to swell without motion. something pressing upward from below but never breaching the surface. Edward gripped the side of the boat instinctively, his knuckles pale. Martha pulled something from inside her coat. A tarnished brass lantern, the glass cracked and smoked from age, but the light inside steady and golden. She lit it with a sulfur match, the flame hissing briefly in the cold air before catching. "This will show us," she said. Edward frowned. "Show us what?" Her mouth thinned. "What listens." She held the lantern out over the side of the boat, lowering it until its glow haloed just above the black water. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, slowly, the water cleared. Not in color, but in form, the liquid thickening into something nearly solid-looking, as though congealed glass. And beneath it, faint and far, Edward saw movement, shapes. They weren't fish. They weren't anything he had words for, except that they swam slowly between massive columns of what looked like carved stone. Structures, towers. A city. He knew it before he even tried to understand it. St. Verina's chapel hadn't sunk alone. The entire hollow had hidden something older beneath its mud, beneath the bones of trees and men. A great stone ring was visible just beneath the boat, broken in places, but still intact enough for Edward to see the engraving symbols etched so deep they seemed to pulse with their own weak light. "This is why they stayed," Martha whispered, voice thin and reverent. The choir. They weren't trapped. They chose to stay, to guard it. Edward swallowed, feeling sweat cold along his spine. Below them, between the towers, pale shapes drifted. They were human-shaped, but stretched, long, their limbs too thin, their faces obscured by what seemed to be veils of trailing darkness. Their mouths moved, though no sound rose, and then Edward realized the humming wasn't coming from the lake itself, it was coming from them. A song sung by the drowned. Martha was already muttering prayers, her fingers tight on a silver charm around her neck. "We shouldn't be here," she said, "not like this," but Edward couldn't look away. The pale shapes turned slowly beneath them, as if they'd noticed the boat. One by one, their heads tilted back, and Edward's heart clenched as blank, sightless faces lifted toward the surface, mouths still moving in perfect, soundless unison. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the wooden hull. The water near the boat shivered, and then the bell tolled. Once. The sound was impossibly distant, but deep enough that Edward felt it reverberate in his ribs. Martha gasped, nearly dropping the lantern as she lunged for the oars. "Row," she hissed. Edward row. He grabbed the handles with numbed hands and pulled. The boat sluggish at first, as though mired in something that did not wish to let them go. The lantern swayed wildly, its golden light dancing across the surface of the water, and Edward glimpsed long fingers stretching upward, breaching the glassy lake with a quiet smoothness that was worse than any splash. "Don't look," Martha barked. "Keep rowing," he obeyed, though every instinct screamed to glance back. The boat lurched forward as he threw his weight into it, the oars slicing water that now resisted more than it should have. Another toll of the bell rolled through the darkness, and then another, faster this time, a rhythm building like the slow beat of a great heart awakening. As they neared the shallows, Edward risked one glance over his shoulder and saw the pale form slipping beneath the surface behind them, disappearing into the depths as the lake stilled once more. Only the hum remained, faint and lingering like the echo of a song not yet finished. They reached the dock in breathless silence, Martha's hands trembling as she pulled the lantern back into her lap. Edward stumbled as he climbed out of the boat, his legs weak, his breath ragged. Martha didn't speak as they lashed the boat to its post, nor as they climbed the path back to her cottage. It was only once they were inside, Dr. bolted curtains drawn tight, that she looked at him and said, "It knows you're here now." Edward nodded slowly, wiping his face with shaking fingers. "I know," he whispered. And deep within, part of him understood he would be going back. Edward stood once more at the water's edge, the same lake that had taken so much and yet still called him back, its surface now dull and cold under an iron sky. He knew there was no stopping what had begun, not after the moonless crossing, not after the song had settled behind his eyes like a memory that was not his own. Martha had begged him to wait, to plan, to gather more than the old tools and frayed gear he had kept stashed away since his youth, but Edward felt the weight of time pressing in on him. There was something urgent about the pull he felt in his bones, as if the lake would close its doors forever if he didn't act now. So, with trembling hands and breath tight in his chest, he secured the old brass lantern to his belt, its cloudy glass panel streaked from decades of dust, but newly filled with oil. He tested its weight, then lowered himself into the brittle leather harness of his dive suit, a relic from another age but still serviceable, patched by his own hand many times before. The air was brittle and cold as he adjusted the weight belts around his waist, then the thick coiled rope to the rowboat's anchor, ensuring he had a line back. No modern equipment, no backup, no one to pull him from the blackness if something went wrong, and Edward already knew something would go wrong. Still, he climbed over the side of the boat and slipped into the water, heat chill like needles driving through the thick suit. He sank slowly, the lantern's flame struggling at first, but then holding steady, casting a dim golden halo through the murk. Black Hollow Lake was colder than he remembered and far darker. As he descended, he could feel the pressure mounting against his skull, a deep thudding in his ears that almost matched the toll of the bell he'd heard nights before. Deeper now, the world above became a faint memory. The water grew thicker, darker, and yet there was something alive within it, a faint silver shimmer that spiraled slowly in lazy, graceful motions around his form. At first he thought it was silt disturbed by his movements, but no, it was something else entirely. The deeper he went, the more Edward realized the light was not from his lantern alone. Below, faint, distant, glimmering like a faint echo of starlight, something was waiting. When his boots touched bottom, the silt rose in slow, swirling clouds, thick and reluctant, as if the lake-bed resented being disturbed. Edward steadied himself, careful not to dislodge his line. His lantern swung gently at his side, throwing beams of light that revealed fragments of what lay buried. There were stones at first, then what appeared to be masonry, broken and jagged. The remains of walls, archways, and half-buried windows, their edges softened by time but unmistakably carved by human hands. The chapel. It was here, right where the map had promised it would be, though Edward had never truly believed. He moved slowly toward what remained of the entrance, his boots sinking ankle-deep in the sludge as he passed beneath a broken archway. His light fell upon a series of carved figures along the walls, faces frozen in poses of prayer and supplication. But as he drifted past them, their eyes seemed too deep, their expressions too knowing. They watched him, he was certain of it. Something ancient had worn itself into the very stone. He forced himself deeper still, through collapsed corridors where long roots hung like veins stripped bare. And there at last, half buried in silt and debris, was the chapel bell. It was massive, larger than he'd expected, its iron shape greened and cracked by time, but unmistakably whole. The silt had claimed much of it, soft layers built over centuries, but part of its rim was exposed to the water. Edward let the lantern drift closer, illuminating the surface, and saw inscriptions he didn't recognize, swirling patterns that almost seemed to move when the light played across them. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. It was there even now, a song. It wasn't audible through the water, not in any traditional sense, but he could feel it threading through his mind, the same way a memory might surface unexpectedly. A tune he had never heard, but somehow knew. It was slow, mournful, but it carried a weight that bent his thoughts toward it like a lodestone. He reached out, gloved fingers brushing the rough pitted metal, and felt something pulse faintly beneath the touch, a vibration that ran through his arm and into his ribs. And then his light caught on something else. Steps, stone steps that curved away from the bell and down, deeper into the ruins beyond the range of his tether. He hesitated, the pressure in his ears building again, sharper now, but his curiosity anchored him in place. The melody grew clearer the longer he remained, and the faces those carved in stone seemed to shift ever so slightly in the edges of his vision. Their mouths had opened. Whether it was the motion of the water or something else, Edward didn't dare question. He knew better. He was not alone here, not even close. And still he lingered, staring down at the bell as if waiting for it to move, to ring again, to awaken fully. But it did not. Not yet. Edward took hold of the anchor line, slowly pulling himself back, his breath ragged and rapid, his pulse racing in a tempo that no longer felt like his own. As he rose, the shimmer of the lake thickened behind him, cloaking the chapel ruins in darkness once more. The song faded, though the echo of it clung to him, humming faintly in his skull as he broke the surface and dragged himself back into the boat. And as he lay there, catching his breath, he realized the lantern's flame had never gone out. It burned steady still, though he knew he had been gone far longer than the oil should have allowed. Far longer. He stared at it, unblinking, and slowly understood this was only the beginning. Edward sat hunched at the bow of the weathered rowboat, his breath ragged and damp in his throat, the cold from Black Hollow Lake having seeped deep into his bones. His hands, cracked and pale, trembled as they fumbled to unfasten the dive harness, the rope around his waist heavy with lake silt and something else, something that clung like unseen tendrils to his skin. Martha sat silently across from him, her sharp old eyes fixed not on him but on the water's surface, her fingers gripping the edges of her shawl so tightly that her knuckles had gone bone white. The lantern's light flickered in the stiff breeze, casting restless shadows across their faces, but neither spoke at first. They listened. The silence that had always hung heavy over Black Hollow Lake was no longer silent. At first, it was subtle, a vibration underfoot that felt as though it belonged to the rhythm of the boat shifting against the faint current. But then Edward's head tilted slightly, involuntarily, as if his ear was seeking something his mind hadn't quite registered yet. A hum, distant and deep, emerged from below. It did not come from the bell, not precisely, but from beneath it, or perhaps from the space around it, seeping up through the lake's black water as though it had always been there and only now was finding its voice again. Edward closed his eyes and strained to listen, but the sound was not something to be heard with ears. It was a sensation more than a tone, like a presence, sure, that lived in the hollows of the chest and reverberated behind the eyes. A melody threaded its way through his awareness, delicate but insistent, and then, beneath the surface, the water began to move, not with the lapping rhythm of a normal wind-touched lake, but with a slow, deliberate undulation, as if something vast and breathing lay beneath them, exhaling for the first time in a very long time. Martha gasped a sharp sound that cut through Edward's trance, and her fingers seized his hand in a grip that surprised him in its strength. He followed her gaze. There, beneath the lantern's trembling light, the water directly below the boat shimmered oddly. Not a reflection, but a faint glow, silver-green and wavering. It spread outward in delicate concentric rings that did not fade but seemed to carve paths into the very skin of the water. And then the outlines emerged, at first faint, little more than tricks of the eye, but growing clearer with every heartbeat. Figures walking as though on streets invisible to the living world, heads bowed slightly as they moved with slow ritual precision. Edward's throat tightened. There were dozens, no hundreds of them, the faintest suggestion of faces gleaming softly beneath the dark waters. Some were robed in ancient garments, their outlines frayed and tattered as if worn thin by centuries of currents, but others appeared closer, clearer, their features more sharply rendered in the gloom. Mouths opened and closed in measured cadence, their silent songs somehow audible not with sound but with the vibration that now throbbed in the marrow of his bones. Martha's whisper was soft but fierce as she clutched the rosary at her throat. The drowned choir she breathed, her voice hollow with awe and fear. They're still singing. Edward could not speak. He had read about them in his great-grandfather's journal, villagers who had gone willingly into the lake when the chapel bell last rang, believing their sacrifice would keep something deeper beneath the silt forever silent. But their song had continued, it seemed, on and on, long after their bodies had been claimed by water and time. The melody that swelled now was not mournful as he'd expected. It was reverent, hopeful even. And yet there was something about it that made the hairs rise along the back of his neck, something in the way the song tugged at his thoughts, drawing him toward the edge of the boat, toward the waiting water. Edward found his fingers loosening around the side as if preparing to slip quietly back into the depths without struggle. But Martha's grip yanked him back, sharp and angry. "Don't listen," she hissed. "That's how they take you." He blinked as though waking from a long sleep. Around them, the ripples tightened, and from beneath the boat, the bell shape loomed faintly, a dark shadow among paler ones. The song rose higher, but with it came a low, guttural undertone, a counterpoint that was not music, but something older, something that rumbled in the spaces between notes. Edward realized with a cold certainty that this was not a song for the living at all. It was a summons, a gathering call, and it was not finished yet. Martha squeezed his hand, her lips moving in a prayer half remembered from childhood, and though Edward tried to join her, he found the words slow to come. His heart pounded as he looked again into the lake-shifting mirror. The faces were closer now. No longer faint outlines, but human visages rendered pale and perfect as marble, their eyes dark wells in which no light shone, their mouths worked silently, rhythmically, singing words he could not hear, but which reverberated nonetheless through the space between his ribs, where breath seemed harder to draw. Martha leaned close to him, her breath warm against his ear. "We shouldn't have come," she whispered. "Not on a moonless night." But Edward shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the slow procession beneath them. "No," he said at last. "We were always meant to." And though Martha's hand gripped his tightly, Edward did not turn away from the sight below. They sat in silence, listening to the song as the last of the light faded from the lantern and the world around them grew very still. The air thickened with a weight that pressed deep into Edward's chest as the lake's surface, once smooth and almost mirror-like in its blackness, began to shudder with an unnatural life. The faint song that had haunted the edges of his mind since their arrival now swelled into something undeniable, no longer a distant whisper caught in the bones, but a layered harmony rising with dreadful clarity. Each note, ancient and resonant, seemed to call out with a name that was his. Edward, it sighed between measures, not from any single voice, but from the collective breath of the dead, each syllable slow and deliberate as if testing the taste of his life on their forgotten tongues. He sat unmoving at first, his hands clenched around the worn edges of the rowboat as it rocked in the growing current. Across from him, Martha had already gone pale, her weathered face lined, not only by age but by an ancestral fear that no prayer could soothe. Her lips worked soundlessly in a plea he could no longer hear. She reached across the widening space between Martha's eyes, filled with something deeper than fear-grief. But she said nothing more. The lake's surface roiled now, spiraling outward from beneath their fragile craft in concentric rings of silver-green light. From below, pale shapes pushed upward. First one, then another, their heads breaking the surface in slow, silent emergence. The drowned villagers. They rose as if carried by invisible hands, the water cascading from their hollow eyes and open mouths that still worked in song. Their faces, bleached of all warmth, bore no malice, but neither did they show peace. It was as though they were carved from river stones, their edges worn smooth by centuries of current, their robes still billowing as though caught in some unending tide. And yet their gaze was fixed with impossible intensity on Edward. Their mouths opened wider, the song growing louder, not in the air, but inside his skull, filling every hollow space with an ache that was both agony and release. One figure, taller than the rest, drifted closer to the side of the boat. His robes were darker, thicker, as if weighted by something more than just water. The ancient seal of the chapel bell hung from his neck on a chain of corroded iron, and when he raised his hands, long, bony fingers splayed wide, the others grew silent. Edward's heart thudded painfully against his ribs, but he did not flinch. "You heard us," the figure intoned, though his lips did not move. "You are the last," Martha sobbed behind him, but Edward did not turn to her. He could feel the truth of the voice inside him, echoing in places words no longer reached. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. The drowned man tilted his head, considering, his pale eyes unblinking. "It is not what we want," the voice replied. "It is what you are always meant to give." A deep groan vibrated from below, as if the lake bed itself was shifting. The surface heaved suddenly, sending a spray of cold, brackish water over the boat. Martha cried out, scrambling to Kay. He balanced, but Edward remained still, his gaze locked with the one who had spoken. The others gathered in a slow, circling dance, their movements in perfect time with the rhythm that now pulsed in Edward's chest like a second heartbeat. "The bell," Edward murmured, remembering the words in his great-grandfather's journal. "It keeps the deep one asleep." The drowned priest nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. "But the song keeps the bell alive." Edward's breath caught as understanding settled like a weight around his shoulders. The choir had never been singing to lull a god beneath the waters. They had been the power holding it in place, bound in endless song to keep its hunger sated. And now their song was fading. They had grown tired. "You need another," Edward whispered, "another to take up the song." The priest's pale face softened, though the eyes remained voids. "You are blood of the first singer. You hear us because you were made to. Your voice can bind what stirs below." Martha lunged forward suddenly, gripping Edward's shoulder with surprising strength. "No," she cried, tears streaking her cheeks as she shook him hard. "Edward, please, don't listen. We can leave. We can go back." But the water boiled again, and beneath them something vast moved, a shifting shadow that blotted out what faint light remained beneath the surface. Edward could feel its presence, vast and ancient, its attention now fixed upon the absence in the song. It was waking. "Martha," he said softly, his voice already distant. "If I don't, it rises." She shook her head wildly, grief tearing her words to pieces. "We'll find another way. We'll find someone else. Not you." But he reached up and took her hand, pressing it to his cheek. "There's no one else," he said. The drowned choir began to hum again, low and mournful, as Edward rose carefully from the bench. The boat rocked dangerously, but the priest raised his hands, and the waters stilled for a moment. "Sing with us," the voice invited. Edward took a shuddering breath, and as he opened his mouth, the melody that had haunted him since childhood poured out, familiar, ancient, and impossibly beautiful. The priest nodded once. The others joined in, their voices weaving his into the old harmony, completing what had frayed with the passing centuries. The lake calmed. Beneath them, the great shadow slowly drifted downward once more, lulled by the renewed song. Martha wept openly now, crumpled at the bottom of the boat as she listened to Edward's voice rise and fall with the choir. His face was peaceful, but his eyes had already gone glassy, fixed on something far beyond her reach. The song would go on, the bell beneath would remain silent, and Black Hollow Lake would sleep for another age. But the price had been paid. Edward's hands trembled as he turned the brittle pages of his great-grandfather's journal one last time, the ink faded and smeared by years of damp air and forgetfulness. Each line seemed heavier now, carrying not just history but confession, revealing truths that had been carefully obscured beneath a veil of half-remembered legends. His great-grandfather, Reverend Josiah Langley, hadn't merely chronicled Black Hollow Lake's descent into darkness. He had stood at its threshold and struck a desperate bargain. A pact made not for greed or glory, but for survival. Josiah's careful penmanship described a presence beneath the waters, older than the village, older than language itself. It slept coiled around the roots of the world, its breathing deep and slow, stirring tides that men mistook for storms and misfortune. The villagers had known it by different names, the sleeper, the deep one, the hunger below. But it was Josiah who had given it a song to lull it back into slumber, a choir of willing souls bound to the chapel's bell that hung over the waters. They sang their hymns not to heaven but to that which waited beneath, and when the old chapel was swallowed by the lake during the great storm, the bell sank, silencing the choir and breaking the chain that held the darkness in check. The villagers had vanished soon after. Not taken by flood or famine as the stories claimed, but by the broken bargain. Their souls bound to the depths, caught forever between service and sacrifice, and now Edward understood why they called to him. He was the bloodline of Josiah Langley, the last of it. His throat was raw from song, his body aching from the strain of lending his voice to the drowned choir. But it wasn't enough. Even with his voice added to theirs, there was something missing, an offering yet to be made whole. Sitting in the boat's creaking belly with Martha silent and stricken beside him, Edward slid his hand into his coat pocket and withdrew the iron key, its weight cold and heavy as stone. It was simple in design, dark with rust, but the notches were finely made, carved with the same looping marks that ran along the pages of the journal. His great-grandfather had fashioned it for a purpose. Edward knew this now, a final seal to the door they had once dared open. He turned it slowly in his palm, feeling the ridges like the teeth of something waiting to bite. Without speaking, he lifted the journal and the key high into the air, as if offering them to the pale faces of the drowned villagers gathered in their silent circle beyond the edge of the boat. Their heads tilted in unison, their hollow gazes fixed upon the items with an eerie hunger not for flesh or life, but for memory, for completion. Edward's breath misted in the chill, his words little more than a whisper. What was lost, I return. The priest, the tallest of them, whose hollow chest bore the ancient chapel's sigil, drifted forward, his pale hands rising, palms open. The surface of the lake between them grew still as glass, reflecting the iron key and the crumbling book with unnatural clarity. And then, slowly, the water parted, not in a rush or a swirl, but as if a doorway had opened beneath them. A deep G, aping hollow of black that led nowhere a living man should see. Edward's pulse thundered in his ears, but his hands did not shake as he leaned forward, releasing the journal first. It tumbled through the cold air and vanished into the hole without a sound, swallowed as if by some bottomless throat. Then came the key. He held it for a moment longer, feeling the cold leach through his skin, as if it drew the last of his warmth. With a breath he hadn't known he was holding, he let it fall, watching it disappear into the stillness below. The lake groaned, a low vibration that shivered through his bones, but did not churn. The priest's hollow gaze remained on him, something like approval if such things remained in its empty stare. Slowly the drowned villagers began to sing again, but this time the melody was different. No longer the mournful dirge that had dragged Edward down through memories and regret, but a softer, gentler refrain. It wound through the cold air like a prayer long forgotten and found once more. The darkness that pressed at the edges of his mind eased, replaced by something like peace. Even Martha, clutching the side of the boat, seemed to breathe easier. She looked at Edward with eyes still wet with fear, but her voice was steadier. "Is it over?" she asked, though they both knew such things were never truly over. Edward didn't answer. He could feel it. The lake beneath them was no longer restless. Whatever had clawed for release had stilled. The offering had been accepted. Yet the knowledge weighed on him. The pact was renewed, not broken. Someone would have to guard it again. Someone would be called to remember. As he sat back down beside Martha, his limbs aching and cold, he realized the villagers' souls were no longer trapped in endless song out of desperation or punishment. They had become wardens, and now so had he. The priest and the drowned choir sank slowly into the depths, their pale forms vanishing into the dark mirror of the lake without.
Dawn crept over the ridges.
Wounds left to them as they moved toward the shadowed shoreline. Edward's arms ached with every stroke, but he welcomed the physical effort, the grounding of it, something ordinary after all they had witnessed. He glanced once more over his shoulder at the lake's center, where the old chapel's spire had once reached up from the water's depths, now hidden beneath the calm. It was as if none of it had ever happened. No drowned choir, no broken bargain, no hollow-eyed priest waiting with outstretched hands. But he knew better. Edward could feel the silence of the lake was not peace, not really. It was waiting, resting. The ancient hunger beneath its floor was fed again, lulled back into uneasy slumber by song and sacrifice. But he suspected it had listened more closely this time, had pressed its ear to the thin places, and heard names spoken in voices long thought gone. He wondered how long the quiet would last. As they neared the crumbling dock, Martha finally looked at him, her eyes dark with exhaustion, but clear. "You heard them, didn't you?" she asked softly. Edward nodded. "They said it's ours now. She gave a faint, humorless smile, more a grim recognition than anything else. "Ours," she repeated. They stepped from the boat onto the wooden planks, their footsteps echoing hollow against the damp boards. Edward paused, standing there at the edge of the lake for a long time, the cool morning breeze tugging at his coat and lifting faint ripples across the water. He could almost believe it was over. Almost. But beneath his feet, through the wood and earth, he felt the faintest hum, a vibration as subtle as breath. The lake remembered. And so did they. Without another word, Edwartha turned and walked slowly up the slope toward the village. Behind them, Black Hollow Lake lay still, quiet as stone. But somewhere far below the surface, where no light reached, something turned in its sleep. Edward returned to the village with a strange sense of calm, one that settled on him like an old coat we discovered after years in the attic, worn, familiar, and lined with quiet purpose. The days that followed moved slowly, softened by the weight of what he and Martha had done, though neither spoke of it much beyond the occasional glance or quiet word shared over tea. They had both seen too much to believe in forgetting. Instead, Edward began to write. Each morning he sat at the old oak desk that had once belonged to his grandfather and set ink to paper, his hand steady despite the faint tremor that had followed him for years. He wrote about Black Hollow Lake, about the chapel that sank, about the drowned villagers and the songs that rose beneath a moonless sky. But he also wrote about the bargain, about the mistake that had nearly broken the fragile chain holding the darkness beneath the waters at bay, and the offering that had restored it. He wrote about Martha's courage and his own doubts, about the strange comfort he found in the knowledge that they had played their part in something far older than themselves. And when the words were finished, bound in leather and placed on the high shelf in the village's small library, Edward didn't feel relief so much as a quiet acceptance. Some stories needed telling, but others needed holding, and he knew now which belonged to which. In the evenings, Edward and Martha often walked the narrow path to the lake's edge, lanterns in hand, their light casting soft halos on the water. They left the lanterns on the shore as offerings, tiny beacons for the lost souls they no longer feared. Some nights they lingered on the weathered dock, listening to the faint lap of water against the posts and watching the silver thread of moonlight ripple across the surface. And when the wind was right, just so they both heard it, a song, faint and far away, carried over the dark water like a memory that refused to fade. It was no longer the mournful dirge that had haunted Edward's dreams as a boy. Now it was something gentler, a chorus of voices calling not in sorrow but in remembrance, as though grateful for having been heard at last. Martha often closed her eyes when she heard it, and Edward would watch her expression soften, something like peace settling over her features, and he knew he wore the same look. Black Hollow Lake was still a place of secrets, of shadows and old stories whispered over fires and under breath, but it was no longer a place of fear. The people of the village watched the lake with a quiet respect, leaving their own lanterns at its edge on certain nights, telling their children to walk gently when near the water. And life moved on. The fields grew golden in autumn. The snow fell thick in winter, and in spring the first lilies bloomed again along the shore. Edward lived out his days in the house he had grown up in, with Martha often visiting, both of them carrying the shared understanding of what lay beneath the calm waters. He didn't need to return to the center of the lake again. Some crossings, he thought, only need to be made once. And though his hand grew weaker with age and his steps slower, his heart felt strangely light when he walked the path to the lake in his final years. On those lengths so deep that words became unnecessary, the villagers who watched them return that morning said nothing either. There was something about their quiet approach, the solemnity in Edward's lined face and Martha's distant gaze, that made people hold their tongues. They docked the boat, tied it to the crooked post at the edge of the weather-beaten pier, and walked home as if they were returning from a long pilgrimage. In a way, they were. Days passed and the sky hung low and gray over Black Hollow, the spring rains coming and going in misty drizzles that dampened the earth but never seemed to quite cleanse it. Edward found himself rising early in the mornings, making tea in the drafty kitchen of his childhood home, the windows streaked with rain, and he would sit by the fire with his grandfather's old journal on his lap, the one he had once found in the boathouse, its pages swollen from years of damp but still legible. He ran his fingers over the lines of shaky handwriting, the ink blotches, the maps of the lake, and the lines of strange symbols that once meant nothing to him. They meant something now. Everything did. The lake had changed him. Or perhaps it had always been waiting for him to return and reclaim something long abandoned. It was Martha who first suggested he write it all down. She came by the house each afternoon bringing fresh bread or soup in a battered thermos. They sat by the fire and spoke quietly of little things, or sometimes nothing at all. But one afternoon, as they sat in the glow of the late sun filtering through the dusty window, she said, "If you don't write it, someone else will invent something poorer to explain it away." He knew she was right. And so he did. The days turned into weeks as Edward took up his grandfather's pen still tucked away in a drawer, its nib stained but usable, and began to set his memories into order. He wrote of his return to the village from Margaret's funeral, of the envelope and the iron key she left behind, of the strange pull that had drawn him back to the lake after all these years. He wrote of the boathouse, its air heavy with damp and memory, and of finding the journal half consumed by water and time. Of Martha's warnings about the drowned choir and how he had not listened, not really because something deeper had already sunk its hooks into him. And he wrote of the crossing, of the moonless sky and the thick thrumming water, and how the lake itself seemed to breathe around them, vast and cold and filled with something old that watched without eyes. He wrote of the bell beneath the water, its surface streaked with algae and silt, its iron mouth frozen open as if forever caught in mid-toll. Of the faces carved into the stone below, and how they seemed to follow him as he drifted past them with his lantern's light bobbing through the gloom. He wrote of the choir waking, of the voices calling him by name, and how he finally understood the truth of the bargain made generations before a binding song meant to hold back something older and darker that clawed always at the edges of the world. And he wrote of the offering, of the return of the key and the journal, and how the drowned villagers had taken them with pale, ruined hands, their faces twisted not in anger but in something like longing, of how the lake's fury had quieted as dawn approached, the waters smoothing out, the choir's song ending in a single mournful note that lingered in the air like the last chime of a bell. When the story was finished, he bound the pages himself in soft leather, just as his grandfather had done long ago. He carried it to the village library one quiet morning, its shutters creaking softly as he entered. He placed it on the high shelf with a label that simply read, "For those who remember." And then he left it there, untouched by pride or ceremony, knowing it was exactly where it belonged. But life didn't end at the edge of that story. It went on as it always does. Edward found that his days moved differently now, each one measured in small rituals that calmed the unsettled echoes in his bones. Every evening he and Martha walked the path to the shore, carrying lanterns they lit from the same flame kindled in Edward's fireplace. The lanterns glowed soft and warm in their hands, casting long reflections over the black water. They left them at the water's edge, each one a quiet offering to the drowned souls beneath. The villagers noticed this strange practice and soon joined them in their own way. More lanterns began to appear along the shore at dusk, bobbing faintly in the breeze, their lights dancing over the lake's smooth surface. Edward took comfort in this. It felt right. On certain nights, when the wind shifted and carried sounds across the hollow, he and Martha would stand together at the end of the dock, listening. And sometimes, if they listened hard enough, they would hear it. A song, faint but clear, no longer a dirge, but something gentler. An echo of a choir that no longer wept but remembered. And it didn't frighten them. Not anymore. It was a song for the living, a reminder of what had been and what had been saved seasons past. Winters blanketed the village in white silence, and spring returned with the cry of birds and the scent of thawing earth. Edward's steps grew slower with time, his hands a little more unsteady, but Martha was always nearby, steady as she had always been. They grew older together in the quiet rhythm of their days, tending small gardens, reading by lamplight, and watching the world continue around them. The lake was always there in the background, still and dark, but not oppressive. Sometimes Edward dreamed of it deep, endless black water in silver shapes moving far below. But he woke calm, knowing he was no longer cold. He had answered once, and it had been enough. In his final year, he found himself walking more often down to the pier alone, his breath thin but even, his cane tapping softly against the boards. He'd sit at the edge for hours, watching the water ripple with wind and reflected light. Sometimes he'd speak aloud to no one in particular, recalling his grandfather's voice, or Margaret's laugh, or the solemn song sung long ago. Martha often joined him later, carrying tea in old metal cups, and they would sit in companionable silence until twilight thickened and the first lanterns flickered to life along the shore. And on his last night, as Edward rested in his old chair by the window, the breeze carrying the faintest threads of song across the fields, he smiled, not because of relief, but because of understanding. Some echoes never fade, but not all are warnings. Some remain because they are meant to be remembered, to be passed on, and to remind those who listen that the deepest places within lakes and hearts and stories are not places of darkness alone, but of memory and belonging. And so Black Hollow Lake remained quiet, its secrets held beneath dark waters where the choir sang softly to the currents. And on the shore, lanterns glowed like stars scattered on the earth, lighting the path for those who remembered to listen.